Welcome back to the I'm Waiting on my YouTube channel, the home of album reviews, discography guides and think pieces. Now today's video is kind of a bit more of a loosely structured think piece than my normal ones, but just go with me. Kind of resulted from the rollout of an album that's coming out next year that I'll get onto, that kind of got me thinking about something, and that something was the relationship between band and producer in the album making process. Because ideally, the role of a producer not only is to engineer the album, but also to kind of guide the band into like various decisions, or at least like have like a helping hand in decisions to make sure that, you know, they get the best out of the album that they're making. Prime example for me would be the man himself, James Towler, who was the engineer and co-producer for the two latest Public Image Limited albums, because as you can see from the behind the scenes clips that they posted, particularly for their last album, What the World Needs Now, you can see that James is definitely a helping hand. Like, the band takes centre stage and they kind of just play whatever they want to play, and John's got his lyrics written down and he knows what he wants to do with them, so he's got an idea of what he wants to do. But then James is just kind of there in the control room while they're recording takes to kind of go, oh, you know, maybe if you put your lyrics there, that would work better there, and this doesn't exactly have to go there, and maybe this bit of the drum break can go here instead of there, and that might help you to do X, Y, and Z.
I just need some more sounds really at some point to go in there, just to kind of make it, the structure and the feel of it is better. You know, it's getting that delivery and getting all the lines in without you feeling as you're tripping up over anything.
There's no space later.
Well, I can make space.
Okay.
It's just an arrangement that they've got, and they're trying to contain. If you've got your lines in, you're not repeating ones to pad it out, and then I can then see how to chop the arrangement to fit with your lines.
Good.
And that to me is what the role of a producer should be, like kind of letting the band do what they want to do, but also giving a helping hand along the way to try and get the best out of the album. Another perfect example would be Beatles producer George Martin, who knew how to enhance the band's songs not only with his use of studio equipment, but also with his implementation of things like orchestral arrangements too. For me, that's the ideal role of a producer, but I thought that today I would guide you through some of the potential pitfalls a band may fall into with a producer. Maybe the producer has too much power and influence, maybe it's to do with some kind of industry factor that means they don't have the best producer behind them for the job, maybe they're coming at it from the wrong angle. There are various things that can go wrong in terms of the relationship between band and producer that I just kind of want to go over with you now. This is maybe one of my, as I say, less structured think pieces, because it's more kind of operating on a hypothetical basis, but hopefully you can find some of my observations at least slightly like insightful, I guess. So the first thing that can possibly have a negative influence on the relationship between band and producer is the kind of industry side of it, more specifically the idea of return on investment. So let's say hypothetically there are two bands. One band is a kind of up and coming indie band, maybe, you know, they've had a few demos, they've got a bit of word of mouth buzz behind them, they're a decently established live act maybe, and they go in to record their first album. Then you've got another rock band who are massive. They put out a few singles maybe on SoundCloud or on Bandcamp, and they are massive. They're an internet phenomenon, you know, they're selling thousands and thousands of downloads and what have you. So they're very, very well established. Maybe it's kind of like a, you know, a main skin situation where they're on Eurovision and they get really big really fast. So then there's the choice of two producers. So if you're the big band who have sold like a ton of, you know, downloads and what have you, the likelihood is that whatever record label, you know, they will put you with, they'll kind of see like, oh, these guys have some serious buzz behind them, you know, we can definitely make a lot of money from this. Like, if they put out an album, it will generate revenue, and so then they might, you know, consider putting you in there with somebody like a really well-established producer, like, hey, you know, get these guys like working with Steve Albini or whatever it is, and so then hopefully they go in there and Steve Albini kind of sits there and goes, right, what do you guys want to do? I know it's your first album, I'm here to help you out, what do you want to do? You know, and the point is that they've got that big producer behind them who is kind of like willing to help them, because the industry side of it have realised like, oh, these guys can probably make us some money, so I feel like if we put them with a bigger, more established producer, that's okay, because we'll make a lot of money in the long run. So there's that. But also, if you're the smaller band and you're going in to record the album, the record company might be like, we don't know if these guys are going to be successful at all, or if they are going to be for very long. So then they might put you in with a less established producer, in which scenario two things can possibly happen. The producer can either not really be the right fit for the band, maybe because they're not very well established, they put them in there with a producer who maybe isn't as like adept at realising like bands' visions or what have you, so it ends up kind of just not being a very good fit for them. Like maybe they're an indie band, but they get put in there with like a fairly middle of the road metal producer or something, just because it's in the same vein. I mean, this is all entirely like hypothetical conjecture essentially, but it's kind of, I hope it illustrates a greater point. So like maybe they put them in there with a rock producer who just doesn't fit them, and it's not really a good fit, but because they're not going to return much money and investment, or that's the thought, that doesn't really matter too much. Or you get the side of the coin where, because the band are so small and they're being put in there with a producer, the producer then takes control, because he goes, right, I know that this band are very small, not very well established, they're making their first album, and I can just get them to do what I want them to do, because they don't have enough money to spend on a better producer. So then you end up in a kind of dictatorial situation, perhaps, which obviously isn't conducive to a good production environment, because it then becomes the producer's album rather than the band's album. Because the band are so small, they can't kind of like fight it too much, because obviously they don't have the money to spend on a better producer, and so that can often be quite a harmful circumstance to end up in. So ideally, if you're a smaller band, I feel like you maybe want to look around a bit more to see who like the reputable producers in your genre are for like a cheap price, or at least like, you know, if you get signed to a record label, maybe have some producers already in mind to recommend to them, so that there isn't as much as that industry meddling going on, to make sure that the band themselves have the best result, if you see what I mean. And that brings me on, I suppose, to a more general point about producer control, because producers can have more control, but that can go very, very right or very, very wrong. And I'll give you two examples, that being Ross Robinson and Bill Laswell. So Ross Robinson, known as the godfather of new metal on the production side, he produced for Korn, Limp Bizkit, Slipknot, on all of their earliest, most formative releases. So he is like the king of new metal production. But his production methods were very unorthodox. He would try as hard as he could to get the rawest performances out of the bands he was working with. So on the first Korn album, on the song Daddy, because it's so personal, like Ross kind of said to Jonathan, like, really let your emotions loose and like just go for it. And then we end up with the situation where the last 3 minutes or so of that track is just Jonathan like literally sobbing in tears, crying in the vocal booth, and then the band just kind of playing over top of that. So, you know, you end up with like a producer who really pushes his bands to the limit. Same with Slipknot, because Slipknot, with their debut album, his production methods, as I've said already, were unorthodox, but with Slipknot that came in full force, because Slipknot were already a tour de force themselves, like just completely riotous, insane live show. And so in the studio, Ross tried as hard as he could to kind of get that energy out of them in a recording base, but how that manifested itself was kind of weird in a lot of places. Either he would get the bands to like drink gallon bottles of water before recording takes, or throw plant pots at Joey Jordison's head while he was recording drum tracks, or wake them up at like 3 o'clock in the morning to go run up the side of a mountain before recording. You know, like just loads and loads of really weird, whacked out stuff, taking Jim Root's brand new rhythm guitar and like drop kicking it across the studio.
And I remember Ross just had his headphones on and he was rocking out to a song, and I had this new Jackson guitar that they just made for me with this custom inlay and fucking, you know, quilt maple top and all this, you know, badass new $3,000 guitar or whatever, and he just drop kicked the guitar right out of my hands.
Like, there was so many things that Ross did that would just kind of seem absolutely, completely out of whack. but like resulted in a great album. I think it resulted in a great album because it was just him trying to translate that energy into a good album. And obviously Slipknot are a band who are not short of vision, but I feel like for me, from what I've heard about Ross's production techniques, it seemed like although the songs Slipknot had were very strong, they really needed that other authoritative figure to kind of go, this is where I want it to go. Because apparently, of course, Ross and I think Joey Jordison also co-mixed it, kind of had the idea of like, okay, no guitar solos, we're going to mix it all on analog equipment, we're going to do it this way, and this is how it's going to be. And kind of having Ross, who had those more kind of off the beaten path methods of getting performances out of his bands, but also kind of a more strong arm approach to the production side, helps Slipknot kind of have more guidance. Like, they had the ideas there and they had the vision there as to kind of like they wanted this big riotous sound, but then Ross kind of knew what buttons to push or what to do to get them there, and kind of a more strong arm approach in that way maybe helped. Same with Iowa in 2001, where he mixed the whole album and produced the whole album while in a wheelchair because he'd broken his arm on a BMX accident, and he'd get the members to the point where in order to get emotion out of Corey for the title track performance, he had him stood naked in the middle of the recording studio cutting himself with jagged pieces of glass while recording vocal takes. He really pushed the bands to the limit, and really, again, on the production side, maybe had a bit more of a strong arm approach. But I feel like in terms of bands like Korn and Limp Bizkit and Slipknot, because it was a new sound, he felt like maybe they needed guidance in order to get the best out of what they needed. And I feel like it kind of says a lot when Korn reunited with Ross Robinson for Korn 3, when they were more kind of adult, I suppose, because this was 2009, so this was 15 years later, and Ross was doing the same stuff that he was doing in 1994. It didn't work, partially I think because Korn were at that time more of a kind of self-assured group. They had a whole discography under their belts by that point, and so Ross having that more kind of unorthodox, blunt, strong arm approach just didn't work that time around. So I think that probably acts as more convincing evidence for what I'm saying. And the second example of a producer with more power that I wanted to discuss was Bill Laswell. Reason being that I think Bill Laswell has both gone right and wrong with this approach twice in the same band, though that band in question being Public Image Limited, with the band's Album and 9. And the reason I say that he's gone right and wrong is because his strong arm approach both worked and didn't work on two separate occasions. So in 1985, the story is John Lydon wanted to go in and record an album with Bill Laswell because he'd recently collaborated with Africa Bambaataa the same year, and Bill Laswell was behind that. So he said, okay, Laswell's going to be the guy to do my next album. But then his more inexperienced band of very young American musicians, when they got into the studio, apparently kind of panicked because John wanted to do a really big, grand rock album of some kind, it seems, and the band just kind of weren't up to the task. And so Bill, in all his wisdom, kind of went, right, fire the band and I'll get musicians. And so you ended up with an all-star cast of people like Steve Vai, Ginger Baker, Tony Williams, Ryuichi Sakamoto as well, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And what we got was Album, one of the best loved albums in Pill's entire discography, with hits like Rise and Home on it as well. And it was a brilliant album, and it showed that, Bill really having a vision of right, I know what musicians I'm going to get, I know how this is going to work. And it did, it absolutely did. But then following the release of Album, John put together a touring band made up, I believe, of him, Lou Edmonds, Bruce Smith and Alan Diaz. And who could forget the legendary John McGeoch? And having proved themselves as a force to be reckoned with when recording Happy with Gary Langan in 1987, it's obvious that when Virgin suggested that the band work with Bill Laswell again, this was a very exciting prospect. Obviously, he produced Album, and that ended up being great. And so with this new band that John was really excited about, obviously working with Laswell again would hopefully yield similar results. Although I think the conflict came in around the sound of the album, because for those of you who don't know, 9 is a much more kind of new wave disco dance influenced album, which I love, by the way, and I think that the 3-album stretch from Happy to That What Is Not in 1992, severely underrated in Pill's catalogue, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So they went into the studio with Laswell on the first day, a set of songs recorded that were going to be on the 9 album, that disco influence prevalent, and apparently Bill Laswell basically said that, like, oh, you know, the songs are crap, your band can't play, you know, we do all this. And I think that Laswell had an idea in his head that he wanted John to make a really tough, heavy metal album, because I think album is probably the closest Pill have ever come to making a metal album. Like, it's the only one of the albums that on Wikipedia is classified as hard rock, so I guess maybe that's it. So Bill had an idea in his head that, oh, John should be making this really heavy record, and so he heard these disco songs and he was like, this is crap, your band can't play, this isn't what you should be doing. And he went, right, here's what we're going to do, I'm going to fire your band, I'm going to get my own people in, I've even written some of my own stuff that we can use, so we'll do that. But then, you know, obviously, because John really liked the band that he was working with at that point, because they were a great band, hearing Laswell basically go, no, they're shit, these songs are shit, get them out, and I'm doing it how I want to do it, John went kind of like politely piss off, and so they ended up working with Eric Thongren and Stephen Hague eventually on 9, and there was clearly some resentment going on about, like, oh, you know, well, John thought Laswell had kind of got his ego much too big and kind of wanted to deliver this supergroup U2 album, whereas Laswell was quoted in the press at the time as saying, like, oh, you know, ask him why he delivered a bad disco album. So there's clearly some bad blood around it, but I think that I'm more tempted to side with John because of my knowledge of how the album was made. It seems not out of character for Bill that because he didn't like this more disco direction that the songs were going in, he kind of went, no, I know what worked last time, we made a rock album last time, I decided how it went and it went well, so we're going to do that again. But because John had more confidence, he just kind of asked Laswell to piss off, and then that kind of ended up kind of creating kind of a bit of friction between them, which is not a situation you want to end up in. And while I do think Laswell is in the wrong for this, I also do think that it illustrates the thing of, you know, having a producer with more power can go right, like with Ross Robinson or with Laswell in the case of Album. But then I feel like when you have those people in, like, when you're working with those people, but when you feel more self-assured, whether it's Korn on Korn 3 or Pill on 9, that can often lead to friction, which is obviously not something that you want to really be going on. A third angle I kind of wanted to touch on as things that could possibly go wrong is when it feels like bands work with producers out of nothing more than a token gesture, or that because of the genre that they're in, that the producer just fits what they're doing, quote unquote. My prime example for this being when bands have worked with Rick Rubin and it hasn't gone the way they think it should. Like, Rick Rubin has made some really good albums. He produced all 5 System of a Down albums, all of which I think are great. He did some Red Hot Chili Peppers stuff, Beastie Boys, like, he's got a lot of really reputable stuff under his belt. But there have undoubtedly been times when, you know, people get put in there, really established groups are put in there with Rick Rubin, and the results have been less than harmonious. And I think, again, it comes down to that central idea of control, because working with producers because of their reputation can be good. Like with Black Grape, they probably worked with Youth because Youth was kind of making a storm with his productions at the time, and so, you know, they put them in there with Youth, and they ended up producing a great album in Pop Voodoo in 2017, and that's fine. You know, if you get put in with a producer and you really hit it off, that's cool. But I feel like with some bands, they just kind of get put in there off of credentials alone, and it doesn't really work very well. Like with Black Sabbath, when they produced 13 with Rick Rubin, I feel like, although they said in like the mini documentaries they did, like, oh, working with Rick was great.
It's great with Rick Rubin in charge, you know, he's got a great track record, and he comes up with some great ideas, some work, some don't, you know, but it's worth trying.
I think he's looking for a raw Sabbath, and I think we're looking for that as well.
It was clearly not that a lot of the time, because they would basically be a thing where the band would play takes and then Rick Rubin would just like seemingly have no problem with it, and then just kind of be like, oh, go again, go again, go again, and like it would drive Ozzy insane. Apparently he just sat them down, listened to their first album and said, go back to this, imagine metal never existed, and Geezer Butler kind of reacted to that like, what are you talking about? That's stupid. Like, you're asking us to actively regress just for the sake of, like, doing something just because you feel like it would benefit. Like, I don't understand. And the same thing, like, he would get amps into the studio that were, like, invented in 1968 for Tony to play, and Tony would kind of be like, well, just because they were made in 1968 doesn't mean they sound good. They probably sound like shit. So, you know, it probably created some tension there as well. Again, Rubin's more hands-on approach of, like, he had an idea in his head of how he wanted things to go, and then kind of just ran with that, regardless of what the band actually thought might have been best for it. Which, you know, I mean, Rick Rubin was established, but I feel like that really wasn't what Black Sabbath needed, especially for their reunion album, is to have somebody having some kind of preconceived notion of what they think the album should be, which links onto a wider point that I'll get onto in a little bit. The other example, again, would be Slipknot when they worked with Rick Rubin for Volume 3, because essentially what happened was Rick Rubin rarely ever showed up to the studio. Like, he maybe showed up for 2 seconds, said that, like, the song sounded good, and then leave, and that actually the engineer Greg Fiddleman, I believe it was, in that time, was actually the like proper producer of the album. I remember Corey Taylor saying that like all he would do would show up for 2 seconds and then leave. You know, he's overpaid, like under-delivers, I'll never work with him again. And so, you know, I think that's maybe slightly less, but it's definitely an example of where like a band is put in there with a producer and it just does not work, like either because his production methods didn't work for them or he just seemed way too distant doing what they were doing, because I feel like Slipknot really needed like somebody at the helm, particularly at that point in their careers where they weren't really getting on very well. They needed somebody perhaps to kind of steer the ship, and with Rick Rubin not even bothering to be there apparently half the time, they obviously didn't get that. A smaller example would maybe be Muse in 2009 when they were recording the Resistance album, and they initially hired Rubin to produce the album, but then eventually scrapped the recordings and produced it themselves. And then later at a 2010 awards ceremony, Matt Bellamy, the lead vocalist, thanked Rubin for teaching them how not to produce. Another example would be Metallica with Death Magnetic, where in an interview Rubin said like, oh, I just said to them like, imagine that nobody's ever heard about Metallica, that your accolades don't exist and you're just a band playing songs, which is kind of like, it links, both of those things links to the idea that Rick Rubin's production style is not for everybody. Like, clearly it didn't click for Muse, and for me the whole Metallica thing of basically telling them like, because another thing he said in that interview was like, oh, you know, imagine that like, you know, nobody knows who Metallica is and you're trying to make your first impression over again. To me that reads as like telling a band like, oh, don't just be shit because you feel like you can coast on a bad album because you've got a discography behind you anyway. Like, anybody could do that. Anybody could literally walk into a room and tell a band like, don't be shit and lazy. Like, anybody can do that. But I feel like the fact that that is what Rick Rubin does and he gets praised for it. Like, the interviewer in that interview was absolutely just melting over it. Like, he was like, oh, I told Metallica, like, don't be lazy. Don't, like, assume that because you're Metallica, people will buy it. Try to make a good first impression again. And the interviewer was like, oh my god, that's why you're amazing. It's like, no, literally anyone could say that.
I can remember when I worked with Metallica suggesting, because they're a very popular band, you know, very well-known, well-loved band, you can rely on the fact that people are going to listen to a Metallica record. One of the writing assignments was, imagine there was no such band as Metallica, and imagine you guys are going to enter a Battle of the Bands contest next week, and you have to write music that's going to blow everybody away in the room, and nobody knows who you are.
That's why you're Rick Rubin. That is brilliant. I'm taking notes because those are just brilliant statements. It's so true, though.
And I feel like, more to the point of what I'm about to make, Rick's production style of feeling like he has a vision himself for how he thinks the album should be and forcing that seemingly on the bands that he works with really isn't conducive to a good environment, particularly in the Black Sabbath example where he said that he was a fan of Black Sabbath when he was producing the album.
I've been a fan of Black Sabbath my whole life.
And that leads me on to the thing that spurred me to make this video in the first place. Don't have fans produce your albums. And the example I wanted to use for this was Mr. Andrew Watt, behind not only the 2 newest Ozzy Osbourne albums, but also the upcoming Iggy Pop album Every Loser, slated for January 6th of next year, because I feel like for me, Andrew Watt is the quintessential example of letting somebody who is a fan produce their albums, or more specifically, like older people with established careers seeing like new blood on the scene and kind of letting them take the reins in a sense because they think it might be good. So like the Ozzy album, he came across Andrew Watt while working on the Post Malone song, they hit it off, and then Ozzy was like, oh, you know, can you write some songs for my next album? And so essentially what happened was Andrew got his mates together and essentially wrote and performed what he thought Ozzy Osbourne songs should sound like. Like there was a big Black Sabbath influence there, and it was a lot more of a straightforward metal album. And you can see that in a lot of the reviews, where a lot of the reviews said like, oh, it sounds like classic Ozzy, it sounds like Black Sabbath and all that sort of stuff. But then again, it links to that idea that Andrew Watt was working off of the template of what he thought an Ozzy album should sound like, rather than what Ozzy wanted an Ozzy album to sound like, if you see what I mean. But luckily for us, I feel like the reason why Patient Number 9 was so much better than Ordinary Man is because after Ordinary Man, where Andrew had more overt control, Ozzy basically sat him down and said, right, after the last album, I've got some notes. I don't want to do this way. I want to do this. I want to do this. I want to do this. I don't want like structured songs. I want to have more loose structures. I decide who we have on the album. I decide who the guests are, X, Y, and Z. And so in that way, letting Ozzy take the reins, and in that way, Andrew Watt playing more of a supporting role than on the previous album, we ended up with a better album. And I suspect that change in dynamic has something to do with that, because I feel like if Andrew Watt had the same level of control that he did on the first album without Ozzy kind of stopping him and going, no, I don't want to do this, we would have essentially just got Ordinary Man 2. And I mean, you know, Andrew probably did have some influence in like, oh, why don't you get Tony Iommi on the album, why don't you get X, Y, and Z, but it was definitely Ozzy more steering the ship on that one, which I think is why we got a better album. With Iggy, however, it's kind of a weird situation, because on the lead up to his last album, 2019's Free, which is more of an ambient jazz affair, Iggy made comments about like, oh, you know, some people have said that maybe the title of Free is me wanting to be free from having to be the guy with no shirt who rocks all the time, and there's something to that.
Later on, some people who heard the album wrote that I guess that means he wants to be free from having to strip and rock or blah blah blah, and there's something to that.
But in the promotion of this new album, the first quote that we got from Iggy was, oh, I'm the guy with no shirt on who rocks all the time, and Andrew understands that. And it kind of confused me, because it was like, hang on a minute, so on your last album you're saying that you wanted to be free from being the guy who rocks with no shirt on, and then in this new album you're saying that you are the guy who rocks with no shirt on, and that is what you are. So in that way, kind of tragically, you're sort of playing into a caricature of yourself, and it seems like Andrew has more control because he and his band, the same band who were on Ordinary Man, were playing the songs, and so it kind of feels like, again, that overt control that Andrew has of kind of being a fan of Iggy and like essentially writing his album for him and just letting Iggy do the vocals on it, because he's like, oh, you know, Andrew gets that I'm just a guy with no shirt on. It's like, no, you literally kind of, it sounds to me at least like you're selling yourself as a caricature of yourself when that's not what you are. When you look at Iggy's discography, barely any of it is actually straight up punk. There's a lot of different stylistic diversions, but I feel like with the singles that we've got so far, it's a lot more of a straight ahead punk or like glam rock affair, just like a more straight ahead rock album. And I feel like because Andrew Watt just kind of maybe sees Iggy as like, oh, godfather of punk, the punk godfather, you know, all this, he just kind of has an idea of what he thinks an Iggy Pop album is in his head, and because Iggy is kind of well established at this point, and he kind of go, oh, you know, Andrew's the new guy on the scene, I'll kind of, you know, I'll let him take the reins. And then what we end up with is essentially an Iggy Pop guesting Andrew Watt album rather than Andrew Watt producing an Iggy Pop album, which is something I kind of brought up in a similar way in the Patient Number 9 review, where like having Andrew take the musical reins as well as the production reins can often result in like not the best outcome for the album, because it is essentially somebody who confesses themselves to be a fan essentially writing your album for you, which is never good. And I'd like to end off on a similar point with a hypothetical situation, if you will. So let's say that I was drafted in to produce the new Slipknot album, and they just let me have full control, disregarding the fact that I have no production experience, and also disregarding the fact that Slipknot at this point in their careers seem like the type of people who, if the producer says that something they're doing isn't very good, they throw him out and find somebody else. I mean, that's just my own, like, how I imagine they are, but that's pure conjecture. Imagine that they just got me in to produce the album, and they kind of had kind of an Andrew Watt, Iggy Pop, Ozzy Osbourne situation, and kind of went, okay, you take the reins. Because I am a fan of Slipknot, but I also have an idea in my head of what I want a Slipknot album to be. I have an idea that it would then kind of turn into, oh, you know, I just want you guys to make the most, like, back to basics, raw, stripped down, heavy, fucking brutal album ever, and then I would go about doing that. But, you know, maybe Corey's like, actually, I'm just in a good place in my life. I want to, like, write songs about how happy I am or something. Or maybe Clown's like, oh, you know, I'm actually thinking of, like, experimenting with some jazz and samba aesthetics on this one. And I'm just kind of like, no, I want to do a heavy album. You let me take the reins. I know what I want to do. I have an idea. I'm a fan. This is how I want your album to sound. And that's obviously not going to be good. Like, it might be an enjoyable album to me at the end of the day, but whether it would be a long-lasting appeal album in Slipknot's discography, I really don't know. And that's the thing. Andrew Watt is making albums for people who let him take the reins, and it seems to be that he has a predisposed idea of what he thinks that particular person's album should sound like in 2022, 2023, and they're just kind of letting him do that without a lot of influence. Again, I feel like the reason why the second Ozzy Osbourne album produced by him was so good is because Andrew had less control, but letting somebody who is a fan of you produce your album is not good, because it takes their predisposed idea of what they think you should sound like and allows them to put it out there, which isn't always conducive to the best album, as it's taking somebody's singular biases and putting them on an album rather than letting the artist dictate where the song goes and having the artist in a supporting role, which is what I said at the beginning of this video you need to do. So what message should you take away from this video? Well, I'm not quite sure. If anything, I guess my message would be that for me, the perfect role of a producer is to let the band do what they want to do and just be there to give them the odd helpful nudge and a poke and a directing along the way. And of course, as I said at the beginning, the producer's main role, if anything, should be to try and streamline and enhance what the band is already doing, rather than trying to take it in a different direction. Not to establish your control so much, especially if they're already established, trying to avoid as much industry meddling as you possibly can if you're earlier on, not allowing people who are fans of you to produce your album because of their own preconceived notions and biases, just letting the band do what they want to do, but having somebody there to kind of guide them through that and kind of making sure that with their help they can produce the best album that the band want to produce. Again, James Towler, perfect example. Pill had an example of the songs. They knew what songs they wanted to write. John had the lyrics all down, and James was just there to kind of be like, oh, you know, maybe that would be better here, or maybe if you did this, it would be easier to do that and this and the other thing. That's what you need. You don't need overt control. You don't want industry meddling. You don't want any preconceived notions to enter the picture. You just want to be able to make the album that you want to make, or artists should be able to make the albums that they want to make, but just make sure that you have a producer there who is on board and willing to help you, rather than assert their own control. So I hope you enjoyed the video. It was a bit more ranty than usual, but I hope it was still enjoyable nonetheless. Another video, again, as I say, coming in the next couple of days, because as I said at the end of the last video, it's just now essentially a blitz till the end of the year. So you had the Stormzy review and the Left Field review, and then I think the video after this will be the Christmas special that hopefully is coming out Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, one of those, hopefully. And then after that, the year in review on New Year's Eve, and then that is the schedule for the end of this year. Going into early next year, there's a couple albums coming out earlier on in the year, so we've got stuff right to get into right as we enter the new year, which is certainly good for me. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to next year, because it feels like, as well as album reviews, I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I'm planning to do in the new year that should be real good fun. So I mean, I guess I hope you stick around. Please subscribe, enjoy yourself, watch out for the new content, and until next time, I'll see you all later.